this effectively ends Borussia Dortmund's season.
Yeah, it does, without a doubt. I mean, obviously out the Pokal after losing to Leverkusen in November or December, I can't remember which one it was. Obviously out the Champions League, that kind of somewhat shocking defeat to Atalanta, and now they're too far behind Bayern to challenge, but probably a little too far ahead to worry about finishing in the top four. And I actually kind of did a bit of a rant about this on social media after the Atalanta game, because I said, look, we're going to lose to Bayern on the weekend, so we can more or less chalk up this defeat. Chalk up the season is done already. And obviously they did, so, that's fine. But I think from a Dortmund point of view, I mean, talk about the game itself. Yeah, I think Dortmund were quite interesting in this game. Obviously, the big talking points were Bellingham dropped and Guirassy dropped, and Benzebaini, I suppose. And Kovac obviously touched on the fact that Guirassy was out because of Ramadan and the need to fast. And he obviously featured later in the game, but we saw Fabio Silva up front with Adeyemi and Maximilian Bayer either side of them, which was a very unusual starting lineup for Dortmund, especially with Sabitzer in midfield, who has kind of been in and out of the team, but I wouldn't say he's probably relied upon or stick on for starting position. But I think I've seen in our kind of group chat, and I was also seen on our subscriber chat on Substack, that I think it maybe suited Dortmund to play as the underdog in this game, even though they were at home. Kovac obviously likes to play very direct, counter-attacking football, long balls, diagonal balls. And I thought Silva actually played quite well with Adeyemi and Maximilian Bayer for the most part. But I think it worked to an extent. And then, they get a goal from a set piece, and then Bayern eventually kind of turn the screw in the second half and go on to win the game. And, I think Kovac obviously came out after the match and kind of said, look, Bayern are a club that can go out and sign players for 70 or 80 million euros, and we're a club. And I thought his wording of it was actually quite interesting. I don't have it to hand specifically, but he says more or less along the lines of, we're a club who sign projects, and some have worked out, some haven't. And I find that quite interesting. I'm not sure it's something that he uses as an excuse. Maybe it's something that he's maybe lamenting a little bit, because, I mean, even if you just talk about that front line, Bayer, Adeyemi, and Fabio Silva, three players that probably cost less than 50 million euros between them, I'd imagine. Silva in particular is, with all the respect, I know he's done a decent job at Dortmund, but he's a Premier League reject. He's a player that got laughed out of Rangers last season, and Rangers weren't particularly good at the time at all. Adeyemi's a player that continues to kind of struggle, I think, for consistency. He's a player that can't even get into the German national team at all because of that. And then Bayer, okay, great. He's done a decent job. He's probably a player for the future. I thought he did pretty well in this game, to be honest with you. But Dortmund are obviously operating on a completely different scale from Bayern here. And I think that's true, but I think you also have to maybe consider how much of that's due to harsh economic realities being true, and how much of that's just down to Dortmund choosing for that to be the case. I think obviously Dortmund don't make as much money as Bayern Munich, but they make enough money to not have a transfer budget, or they make more than enough money to the extent that the fact that Job Bellingham breaking their transfer record last summer for a pretty paltry sum of money in the grand scheme of things, I think underlines the lack of money that Dortmund are prepared to invest in their squad each and every season. And after the Atalanta game, I was on social media chatting about this, and I think the conclusion I've come to is, I think at the way that this season is going to fizzle out, there'll be a lot of kind of animosity towards Kovac. I think a lot of people point to the fact that Dortmund haven't really shown up in big games per se, even though they did okay in this match. And if I'm not mistaken, they put up a decent fight against Bayern in the previous fixture. But they get knocked out by Leverkusen. Results against Leipzig haven't been fantastic. And obviously they haven't lost both games to Bayern, and then knocked out of the Champions League to Atalanta after not being particularly great. in the group stages either. So I think you can point to all that and say, maybe Kobel should have done better, and I do understand that point. But I do also think this squad is severely underfunded, and I think the club, which is, by the way, one of the richest clubs in the world. It might
I
not be
just
the
pulled
richest
the
club.
statistic because I knew you were going to go there.
Well, if you've got that UEFA report that went out last week and it shows the revenue, I'm sure you can probably enlighten anyone who doesn't know this, but
Yeah,
Dortmund are among the richest clubs in the world.
top
And the
10.
fact that, there we go, one of the top 10 richest clubs in the world, and they behave as if they're, with all the respect, Borussia Mönchengladbach sometimes. We couldn't possibly spend more than 30 million euros on a player. Come on, give me a break. We couldn't possibly challenge Bayern. Oh, if only we could spend 70 million euros the way that Bayern can. No one's really asking Dortmund to spend 70 million euros. They maybe asking them to spend more than 20 million euros on a defender for a change. And I think that's the issue here. I think there's just a complete lack of ambition from the club um, because it's run by an accountant. And I think that's fundamentally the issue. And it's always has been the issue for a long time at Dortmund.
Well, I think the real issue, accountants, they run by politicians. Bayern Munich is a club run by footballers and football people. I know that's not currently the case, but always has been fundamentally, there's always been footballers at Bayern Munich. And that has not always been the case at Dortmund. They tried with Matthias Sammer to bring him in and bring more football people in. They brought in Lars Ricken now too, someone who was very successful at Borussia Dortmund from a different era. I think I underline quite well that where Borussia Dortmund as a recent phenomena in terms of being a big club in Germany came from in the preview piece I did for the Substack, right? There was a time in the 1990s where Borussia Dortmund became very big very quickly because of UEFA money, right? And I'm talking previous to the Champions League. There was a time where you would make a lot of money by just getting really deep into UEFA Cup. And there's people now from that era that are slowly taking over. And there's more football people involved, Sebastian Kehl, Lars Ricken, and so on. And Carsten Kramer took over from Watzke. But I think there's always been a fundamental belief and understanding that this team avoided death, financial bankruptcy. And that is, for a long time, has always been an underlying issue. They remind me oftentimes, I sometimes, I have friends who always buy, I'm someone who likes to buy the most expensive thing because I know it will last. I have friends who like, oh, you're spending so much money on your wash machine. And then they buy 5 wash machines from like Samsung, while I buy like one wash machine a year, every 10 years from Miele, right? And they spend like, I had this fight recently, this is why I bring this up, but they ended up then spending twice the amount of money that I did because they went for the cheaper wash machine. Dortmund are like my friends. Like
There's
buying,
there's an
buying
expression in the UK. I don't know if it's in the US, but they say buy cheap, buy it twice.
Yeah, that's it. I haven't heard that expression, but I will definitely use it in my next fight. It's that Borussia Dortmund are like that. So Bayern Munich, when they needed a top striker, they bought Harry Kane, right? And
Yeah,
Borussia
sorry, but I had my mic muted there, but yeah, for sure, yeah, exactly.
and Borussia Dortmund will go out, and when they sold Jude Bellingham, they're like, oh, his brother is around, let's buy him. Or like, oh, there's this guy, Fabio Silva, he had like half a good season at Benfica back in the day, let's buy him, even though he scores like 0 goals. It's like, if he doesn't score goals in his previous clubs, what makes you think that he will score goals for you now? That is not how this works. There's this scene in Moneyball, and it's also in the book, where like one of the scouts tries to tell Billy Bean is like, yeah, what is his first base percentage? And they like say the number, and he's like, oh, well, that's not very good, is it? And it's like, yeah, but he has the potential to get that good. It's like, yeah, but we're not buying potential. We're not a club that can afford to buy potential. We have to buy factual numbers. We have to buy the guy or draft the guy who has the guaranteed number. So what makes Borussia Dortmund think that a guy like Fabio Silva who has no track record in a top 5
Yeah.
league of scoring goals on a consistent basis, can
Hmm.
be your 25 goal scorer plus.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I think fundamentally at the core of this is Dortmund have maybe been a little too good at what they've done to an extent. They've been a victim of their own success off the pitch in the
Yeah.
sense that, they've found a winning formula to make a lot of money, and that's by selling guys like Christian Pulisic,
Mhm.
Jadon Sancho, Jude Bellingham, etc., Erling Haaland. I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
And, I've talked about that. I've talked about this season in regards to Eintracht Frankfurt, um, maybe to an extent RB Leipzig, maybe even Stuttgart. But the way that
But these are
European
clubs that
football
need
is
to
now,
make up the gap, financial gap to Bayern Munich and Dortmund. And the
yeah,
reason why
although
Dortmund
yeah,
had the strategy was that because they tried to make up a gap that existed at the time that was it to the Bayern Munich.
exactly. So Dortmund were basically the first ones to figure out we can develop players and sell them to Premier League for a premium,
Yeah.
and that's how, on paper, they could make up the gap to Bayern. And since then, Frankfurt have copied that, Stuttgart have copied that, Leipzig have copied that. But along the way, I think these clubs have realised that, especially now, where the demand for players is so fierce now, and so I mean, there's players in Ligue 1 who are, Liverpool signed a defender in Ligue 1, 19-year-old kid, might even be younger than that, has played like half a dozen games or something at senior level. It's got to such a point now that you don't actually have to be successful. In fact, we were discussing this at work recently, actually, in terms of doing a review of the January transfer window, and one of our
Mhm.
colleagues made the really important point. I thought he said, clubs don't sign players anymore based on what they've done. They sign them based on their profile and what they could do.
Yeah.
So if you've got Premier League clubs with a huge amount of money and cash burning a hole in their pocket, and they have to go out and make a statement or sign players every summer, they're going to the Bundesliga, they're going to Frankfurt, they're going to Dortmund, they're going to Stuttgart, and they're signing these players before they've even accomplished anything now. So maybe back in the day, a player like Marco Reus or Mario Götze, or Robert Lewandowski would have had to have actually won something or done something to earn a transfer fee that gave Dortmund that financial benefit of raising these players. It's now got to a point now where these players don't even have to do anything, and the club still gets paid. A good example of that is Jamie Gittins going off to Chelsea in the summer. So for a club like Dortmund, and it is the same at Frankfurt, etc., they don't actually have to succeed to still win off the pitch, and that's why we're talking about the fact that Dortmund are still in the top 10 or one of the top 10 richest clubs in terms of revenue. And I genuinely think that feeds into the entire way that the club is run, to be perfectly honest with you. There's more interest in making money than actually winning anything, because it's much easier to make money than it is to win anything in European football these days for these German clubs.
Well, you need to make the next step, right? I can understand why Frankfurt and Leipzig are not quite there yet. They're not quite there in terms of revenue, jersey sales, etc. To make that next step and become, oh, we no longer need to sell players. Now we need to keep them. Bayern Munich made that decision famously in 2008-ish, 2009, when they said, we're not going to sell Frank Ribéry to Real Madrid. And from that moment onwards, they were a top 3 club, right? Like they said, we're the top of the food chain. We don't care who's coming. We rather lose someone like David Alaba on a free than selling a player. That was a conscious decision to say, we're at the top of the food chain. Players don't leave Bayern Munich. At some point, if you want to become a big club, that's the decision that you have to make. And I think that is what's frustrating about where we are now in the Bundesliga table. There is no second team in Germany can do it. And yeah, the Klassiker, it was great. It was a good match. But it's just not fought on even terms yet, because one of the teams hasn't quite figured out how to get on even terms. And yes, Bayern Munich will always be bigger than Borussia Dortmund. Just like Real Madrid will always be bigger than Barcelona. But that's a fact. Real Madrid are the bigger of the two clubs, right? Yet Barcelona has found a way to still challenge them on an even balance, right? The same can be said in Italy, where there's several big clubs that are not all financially even, but they all found ways to be competitive in that
Yeah.
league. And I hope I
I
didn't
think
offend any Real or Barcelona fans, but like, just look at the financial reports. There is numbers there that indicate a financial gap between Real Madrid and Barcelona. That's a real thing.
I mean, in terms of like Dortmund, I think the issue is the balance. I don't think any Dortmund fans begrudge the club developing players and selling them because that's
Yeah.
just the modern way of doing football. But there just isn't that balance there. They don't have a squad there of seasoned pros. They don't have a squad there of ambitious players who want to win titles, and they don't even have to look that far to find a template. And that was, of course, Leverkusen under Xabi Alonso, which did have exciting young players that eventually were sold for astronomical fees. But it was also a squad that had a lot of seasoned pros who were there and signed to win things. The club signed Granit Xhaka, Grimaldo, other players along those lines because they wanted to win things. And I'm just not quite sure Dortmund are really particularly interested in doing that right now. And that's why, to kind of bring us all back and maybe wrap up, because we do need to talk about Bayern before we wrap things up here. I think it's a squad that's severely under funded. I think it's a team that's missing a lot of key players. Um, and what'll be really interesting to see what conclusions Dortmund take from this season, and whether they go out and spend a lot of money, or whether they just basically spend the summer trying to flog, Felix Mecha to the Premier League, and then hoping they can make 50 million euros off him, and then see where they go from there.